Hey guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to be going over shading and materials and kind of just the basics of that kind of stuff. So as you guys know, in Blender you can either make your own material, you can download one, you can do a 3D scan, but what I'm going to be going over today is the nodes, because a lot of you guys have been asking me about nodes and what they are, what they mean, how to use them. So I'm going to go ahead and head over to the shading tab up here, and I'm going to expand my screen so you guys can really see what I'm working on. And we're just going to go over like the absolute basics. So right now we're in cycles. I'm in my rendered view in the viewport here, and I have a round cube or a sphere, and we're going to go ahead and make our own custom shader for it. So the very basic, most basic shader you can make is, if I click on new, a principled BSDF. And basically what that is just paint. So I like to think of it as just a regular coat of paint that you have on your object. Now, a lot of people there's going to be a lot of controversy in the comments, I can already tell, about the technicalities of shader nodes. But I'm just going to go over everything that I know and show you guys kind of the absolute basics. So we'll start out with the principled BSDF. What is it? It's basically a layer of paint. If we raise different values, such as this metallic value, you'll see that it starts to look more metal. If you lower the roughness, you'll see that more light starts to bounce off of it and it becomes reflective. I'm also going to add a subdivision surface to this so it's a little bit smoother. And I just want to show you guys something as well. I'm actually going to remove this. If you right click on this and click on shade flat, notice how everything kind of just looks a little bit weird. That's because this is the actual geometry of our object. When you click on shade smooth or shade auto smooth, Blender tries to interpret what this thing would look like if it was smoothed out, right? So it's kind of similar to adding the subdivision surface, a little bit different. But as you guys can see right now, we have this very metallic material. Now you can see we have our base color here. If you click on the base color, you can pretty much make this whatever you want. And as you can see, it's changing the color of our object. So at this point, if I wanted to make it blue, I could make it something like that. And we have different options down here, such as hue, saturation. You can switch over to RGB. I normally like to use the hue and saturation settings. It's just easier for me. But you can also type in a custom hex code. Now, something to keep in mind is the lighting in your scene is going to drastically affect the way that your material looks. And I think a lot of people don't talk about this enough, but when you're making new materials, just remember that it's going to look different depending on what's in your scene as well. So if I was to add in a floor plane here, bring it below our object, people will probably say, well, that material looks completely different, right? That is because there's something underneath of it. I know you guys are probably saying, Kenny, I'm not stupid, but I get these comments all the time. How did you make that material? How does it look so glossy? How does it look so reflective? Look what happens if we make this floor material black. Completely different effect on our object. Again, think about what's in your scene. Think about the lighting that's hitting your object, how it's going to react when it hits your object, right? So we have this floor plane is reflecting on our sphere here. That is so important. Watch what happens if I duplicate this, rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis, and move it over here. Now look at our object. Completely different effect, right? So again, guys, not trying to come at you for not understanding lighting, but lighting is just so important. And if we take this plane here and we make it white, now our object's going to look completely different because it's just here. A better way to show this is to raise this roughness value of our sphere. So look at it right now. Now watch what happens when I hide this plane, right? Completely different lighting on the sphere here. Now the reason I'm showing you this is because it seriously has a huge impact on how your material is going to look. Now with a very low roughness, you're going to be basically reflecting every single object in your scene. So if you were to duplicate this, right, we're now reflecting this other sphere. Now, I want to show you guys really quickly before I hop into the depths of the nodes here. If you guys really like this material, right, you love the roughness, you love the metallic look of it, but you just want it to be slightly different for this one, a way to duplicate your material is there's this little button right here that looks like kind of two pieces of paper on top of each other. Click that, and what that's going to do is it's going to take all of your material settings and basically make a copy that you can now change the color of. So now I have basically the same material with a different color on both of these. So that's just a really quick way to iterate on your idea. Let's say you just want to try one more variation here and you want to try something yellow. Well, be careful, because if you change this to yellow now, it's going to change both of these. So instead, I'm going to undo that, duplicate this material, and I'm going to make this one yellow. And now we have 3 spheres with the same roughness value, metallic value, just different colors. And what's really cool is if you look in here, you can see that we have a green reflection here from this blue sphere because this is yellow. So when you combine these 2 colors, you get green. So it's kind of just interesting to look at how everything is going to reflect here. So anyway, just something I wanted to point out to you guys. Now, as you guys can see down here, you can also rename your materials. So if I click on my yellow sphere, I can name this yellow. If I click on my purple red sphere, I'll just call this, I'll call it magenta for now. And then for my blue one, I'll just call this blue. Cool. So as you guys can see, everything is named differently. And then if you pop open this drop down here, you'll have a list of all the materials you created. Now let's say you're really, really happy with this yellow color and you want these other 2 to be yellow. You could come down here, select yellow on both of these, right? Or you could use this shortcut trick, right? You click on both of these and then you shift click yellow, right? Like that. Control L, and you want to click on link materials. That is an easy shortcut to copy any material over to multiple objects. And it would work with the plane too. For now, I'm going to undo this. So let's go ahead and experiment with a little bit more of an abstract material here. Now, before we really get into the nodes, like I said, I just want to go over a few more basics right here. So right here, we have our principal BSDF. To add any new node into your scene, you go ahead to add up here on the top left, and then you build a search for any node. If you already know the name of it, in my case, I'm looking for glass, you type in glass, and you'll see we have a couple different options here. Glossy BSDF is probably because that's the closest spelling to glass, but I'm going to click on glass BSDF. Now you see if I drag it out here, I can place it wherever I want in this little space down here. Now, right now, we have our principal BSDF plugged into our material output. If we were to unplug it, you'll notice that everything turns black. And that's because there's nothing plugged into our output. So I'm going to actually click on this, X to delete. Now, just like everything else, when you have something selected, you can click on G to move it around. That's the shortcut. And then when you guys click on this little dot here, you're going to be able to drag this wherever you want. So I'm going to drag this input to our output. So as you can see, when I do that, I now have a glass material. So that's the absolute basics of how to create any material. You can search for it up here, go to shader, and you have all these different options here. This is a glass shader, but let's just say I wanted it to be a glossy shader. I could then switch this out right here. Now you'll see this thing's just floating here, right? Now be careful when you move nodes around, because if I was to move this node right here, watch what would happen. It would then swap out, right? Because when you move nodes across these lines, they want to connect, right? So I'm basically saying, hey, connect this however it's possible. When I hover over this, see how it turns white? Blender is looking at that and saying, okay, how can I connect everything together? It looks like you want to put this node in between these 2 nodes. And I release this, and as you can see, it's going to plug it in any way that it sees fit. Now, this is extremely useful when you want to create a mix shader. So let's say I want to mix a glossy BSDF with a glass BSDF. How would I do that? Let's go ahead and search for mix. Now you'll see there's a bunch of different options here, but the one we want to choose is mix shader. So if I click on mix shader, I'm going to put it right here. Now watch what happens when I click right here. See how everything gets plugged in for me? And we're going to have this little option called FAC. And basically what that is the mix between the 2 materials. You'll see if I turn it all the way to 1, it's going to turn black again. And the reason it does that is because there's no second material hooked up to this slot. But if we hook up our glass to this slot right here, it's going to turn glass. And that is because the FAC, or the factor, is only going to primarily choose this glass. Now, if we turn it all the way to 0, it's going to choose our glossy BSDF, right? And again, you can adjust these individually. But the key here is the factor. So if I turn this up to like 0.5, for example, and you can type in any custom value, you'll notice that we have a mix between a metallic material or a glossy material and glass. This is extremely powerful. This is how people create their own materials. They use what is called a mix shader. Now, what's really cool like I said, guys, is you can now take these and make them whatever you want. Let's say we make our glossy blue, but we also want our glass to be yellow. What do you think is going to happen when I turn my glass to yellow? There you go. So you don't really know until you try it. But as you guys can see, if I turn my factor down, up or down, we're basically going to be transitioning between these two materials. And this is super powerful. Now you're probably wondering, well, what can I plug into the FAC? Well, this is where it gets even more powerful. So this FAC is going to determine which material we see more of, right? If the FAC is at 1, we'll see the glass. If it's at 0, we'll see the glossy. And if it's in between, we'll kind of see a little bit of both. But it doesn't quite look right. How do we control how this actually looks? This is where you can start to add things like a Fresnel node. Fresnel, basically, well, I'm going to plug it in and show you what it does. We're going to plug this into the FAC. Now watch what happens. You're not going to notice much, right? But if you start adjusting this value, you see what's happening on the outer perimeter there? See how that glass is peeking through on the outer edge there? That's kind of what Fresnel does. Now there's something really similar to Fresnel called layer weight. I'm going to add that in. And I'm going to show you the difference here. So right now we have our Fresnel plugged in. Now if we clicked on facing from the layer weight and we plug that into the FAC, you'll notice how we have a slightly different effect, but it looks really cool. Now, depending on where you're facing your object, like where your camera angle is or where you're looking, you're going to get a completely different result. And this is super powerful. And again, you can play with these settings. You can plug in your Fresnel here, and you can adjust your blend setting. You'll notice how as I turn this up and down, you can kind of see this radius increase and decrease. This is so incredibly powerful. A lot of the times I'll usually use a layer weight with facing, something like that, and then you can kind of adjust this as needed. And again, guys, you can still individually adjust the things that are plugged in here. So let's say you wanted your glass to also be like a slight shade of blue. You could do that. Now, you'll notice, again, when I adjust these things, you can get completely different results. Now, there's something even more powerful. Let me go ahead and plug in a color ramp here. So I just typed in color ramp, and as you can see, we have this little thing that looks like a gradient. This you can also plug into different things. So you can plug your color into your blend here, and then you could adjust this like follows. So watch what happens as I do this. So we have this color ramp here, and if you really zoom in on our material here, and I go towards the sun, there we go, you can kind of see that as I drag this slider in, notice what's happening here. We can kind of adjust where things are happening. So right in the middle there, we have this kind of more rough material that's coming from our glossy, right? And then also, if we adjust the roughness here, this will be a lot easier to see. If I adjust my roughness of my glossy to 0, and I zoom in here, you can really see it coming through right here. It's really hard to see, but you can kind of see it. There you go. So you can kind of see how towards the middle, it's more reflective, and towards the outside, it's more see-through. So this is just an extremely powerful way to do this. And again, so that you can see the difference more easily, I'll just make this yellow. And now you can see how our mix shader is actually making things look. Now, if I made this saturation of 0, we have this really interesting material here that's so powerful. Again, you don't have to use this color ramp. You can mix and match as you need to. Very, very powerful stuff here, guys. So that is the basics of how to create a mix shader. Now, how do we kind of like add even more to this? Well, I'm going to keep this one where it is. I'm going to click on our purple sphere, duplicate that, and then I just want to show you guys one more quick shortcut. If you press period on the numpad, it'll zoom you in to whatever you're selecting. So if I'm really far away in my scene and I have something selected and I select period on the numpad, it'll now zoom me right into the thing I'm selecting, and now we're narrowed in on this. Now what I want to do is I want to duplicate this material, and I want to start from scratch. I kind of want to just make this, I don't know, saturation of 0, something kind of chrome looking like this. Now what can we really do here, right guys? You probably saw the color ramp from before, right? I want to show you something. I'm going to type in color ramp. Now you guys remember, right here is our base color, right? We can just decide any color we want this thing to be. What if we wanted this to look a little bit more unique? What would happen if we plugged our color into our base color? All right, so you're not going to notice much of a difference, right? But watch what happens when I start messing around with these sliders here. Let me click on my color here. So let's pick blue and white. Now watch what happens now. You guys notice what's happening here? It's kind of mixing these two colors. So how do we define where this gradient really is? This is where mapping comes into play. I'm going to add a mapping node. I'm also going to add a texture coordinate node. Now watch what happens. This is how we're going to plug all of these things in. You guys paying attention, right? Vector into the FAC, and then generated into the vector. Now this is normally what I'll do when I'm making a gradient, right? Watch what happens when I start adjusting this gradient now. Do you guys see what's happening here? You can see where that break is, right? Now you can also adjust things like this right here. We have linear, B-spline, constant, ease, and cardinal. Now they're all going to give you slightly different effects. Oops, there we go. Constant basically has a harsh transition. There is no transition, excuse me. So it's basically going between the blue and the white. And you'll notice as I drag these sliders, we're getting completely different results. So if you wanted like a half sphere that looked something like that, that's how you could create that. And down here with our color ramp, you can add even more colors. So let's say I wanted to add another color. I really like yellow. Now we have this really cool striped looking thing. You know what? I also love like a nice purple or cyan kind of color. So I'll go for something like that. As we drag these sliders, we can also drag our gradient that is on top of our sphere. So there's a lot of control we have here. Now, if I switch this off from constant back to like maybe linear, you're going to notice a smoother transition for our gradient. Now, I want to show you guys one more thing. I'm going to go back to constant. You're probably wondering, well, what the heck is all this mapping for, right? There's a lot going on here. Let me show you. If you hold shift, you can slide these very easily in increments. Notice what happens when I slide the X value. We're actually basically taking that gradient and we're moving it along our shape here. We can do the same with the Y. You're going to get different results depending on what you're dragging here. You can also adjust your rotation, right? You can adjust the rotation of all axes, and this is really where the true magic comes in, the scale. I mostly adjust the scale when I'm messing around with these things. Watch what happens if I mess with the scale. Now we're getting some really powerful results here, right? Again, holding shift while I do this so that I don't adjust anything too quickly, but this is starting to look really cool. The other thing that we can do with our mapping is we can decide where our mapping comes from. Right now it's coming from generated, but you can see that there's different results depending on what you plug in. Now, if you type in, or if you plug in camera, this is really cool. If you plug in the camera, you're not even really going to see your gradient because of the way that it's mapped out. I'm going to set everything to 0 so you guys might be able to see this. There we go. If you type in window, you also get a completely different result. Notice how as I move around, this thing's updating in real time based on my camera angle. So similar to camera angle, this window will basically not let you see the rest of the gradient unless you adjust where it is. So again, it's basically, this is how you create these really, really cool effects where you look into a room and you can only see things at a certain angle. This is how you would do something like that. I typically choose generated because it's the quickest way for me to see kind of what's going on, and I can quickly create my gradients from this. Now, this looks really cool and gradients are fun, but how do you create just a little bit more of an interesting effect? Well, this is where textures come into play. I'm going to type in texture, and you're going to see all of these different options come up. One of my favorite ones that I like to use is Voronoi, and then of course Musgrave. So I'm going to show you some of the differences here. If I click on Voronoi and I plug it in right here, you're going to notice what happens. We have some sort of a texture here. We can adjust the scale of our texture, the randomness of our texture. You can see it's more uniform when I pull the randomness down, and as I turn the randomness up, you're going to get different results. Now, let's try a different texture. How about a Musgrave texture? So I'm going to go ahead and put my Musgrave texture here, delete this one, and I'm going to plug the vector into the vector, and I'm going to plug my height into the FAC of our color ramp. Now look what happens. Very interesting results here. Now, what's really interesting about this is there's just so many settings that we can go over. And to be honest, a lot of making your own shader is messing around with the settings. You're going to be doing a lot of experimenting. And what's really cool about these nodes, guys, is we can actually animate any of these values. So if I wanted the scale to start down really low at something like 3, and then later go up to something like 6, I could actually insert a keyframe on any of these values. So everything that you're seeing here is completely animatable with keyframes. And again, guys, don't forget you can adjust your sliders over here with your gradient. And if you want to, you can switch back to linear. So you have more of a smoothed out effect. And you'll notice how this completely affects our shader as we start modifying it. Now, what's really interesting about this texture is you could duplicate it and you could plug this texture into itself. Let's just go ahead and see what happens. Shift D to duplicate, and then I'm going to drop it right here. Now we have an even more interesting texture. So we're actually plugging one texture into another. And look at the results that we can achieve by doing this. It's very, very interesting. And guys, there is so much that you can do with nodes. This is barely scratching the surface. Look at all of these different dots here. Every single one of these dots is an input, right? And then of course you have your material output here. Now what's really cool here, guys, is I could plug in this same color ramp into our roughness. And look what happens. We're now controlling the roughness with our gradient. So you're gonna see it's very, very rough. So you might not wanna do that, but what's really cool is you can plug in you can basically plug anything into that socket. Again, that looks pretty cool too. So it's really, honestly, guys, in truth, it's a lot about experimenting. You want to experiment with these values. I could plug another Musgrave texture in, and now I have this even crazier looking texture. And guys, one thing I do want to show you, if I turn off this subdivision surface modifier, notice how it drastically changes our shader. The actual geometry of the shape that you're applying your shader to is also going to affect the way that it looks. So right now, we're at a subdivision at about 2. If I bump that up to 3, notice how as I go down and up, it's going to affect our shader, right? Remember, guys, the more complex the geometry, usually the longer the shader will also take to load. But look at how smooth those rings are because my geometry is much smoother. Now, I just want to show you guys a couple more tricks here. You're going to notice there's a lot of values here, right? What if you wanted all these values to be the same? How would we go about doing that? Well, we could add a value node. A value node is exactly what it sounds like. You zoom in here, it starts out at 0. Basically what this is a way for you to control different aspects of your node setup with one piece, right? So let's say all of the scales for all of these textures, they're a little bit different, right? This one is less than this one. These two are the same. What if I wanted them all to be 7, right? So I wanted them all to be 7. So I type in 7 here with this value, and then I'm just going to plug this value into the scale for each one of these. There we go. So now this value is controlling the scale for all of these. So if I zoom in here, I can shift click and hold this and adjust the value for all of these at once. This is so powerful. This is how you create your own customizable materials. Now, I won't go into that today, but again, guys, look at this value here. Now, I want to show you guys one more trick here. The value is great. Like, let's say you really like 2. Value of 2 looks fantastic, right? But you know what? You want to also be able to easily increment that. Well, this is where the math node comes into play. The math node is also extremely powerful, and you'll see it being used all the time. Basically, the math node takes a value, and you can apply different functions to it, comparisons, all these different things. Mainly, the ones you'll probably be using are divide and multiply. Now, I just want to show you what divide will do. If we go ahead and plug divide into here, and we're going to have to replug everything in here, like, oops, sorry. There we go. You want to go ahead and plug it in like this. So first the value is going to go into our divide, and then it's going to go directly into our inputs there. Now right now the value is at 2, right? But if we want to increment it very, very, very slowly, we could divide it by like 0.1. And what's really cool about this, I'm sorry, not divide. Let's do divide by 10. There we go. So now watch what happens when I adjust this value. Notice how much slower it's adjusting. And this is because we're dividing it by a large value. Let's try it, 20. Oops, that's 200. Try 20. There we go. So now as I adjust this, I have much more fine precision control over my shader. Before, when I didn't divide this value, it was just moving way too quickly. Now, when I move the slider here, I have such precision control over my shader, it's ridiculous. And again, this is how people are creating these very, very fine-tuned results. So with that, guys, that is pretty much how you do something like this shader here. And I do think this looks fantastic. And what's great is you can come back here and you can completely adjust all of your settings as usual. Let's say you really don't like some of these. You just want this to be white, something like that. That looks good. And again, don't forget, you can do constant like that. There's a lot of power in just this node setup alone. I hope you guys are learning something because this stuff is just so powerful. And it's a lot of fun to mess around with these materials. Let's see, what did I go over so far? I went over how to make mix shaders. I went over how to do like basic texturing. Again, there's so many textures that you can use. For example, and I'm just curious, let's just try it. You could plug in another texture here before our color ramp. What happens if we plug in a brick texture? Interesting. So I don't love the result, but again, this is kind of the types of stuff that you can mess around with. If you wanted something like that, you could create it. And I'm just trying to give you guys options here. Don't forget, X is to delete a node, G to move it around, and then if you want to duplicate, it's just the same as it is in the 3D space. But I hope you guys are enjoying this because this stuff is just so much fun. Now let's say we really, really like this, right? And we're in love with this material, but we want to take it a step further. Well, let's go ahead and make it into a mix shader. Let's go ahead and plug the mix shader in right here, right? Now, what do we want to mix this thing with? Because right now it's not mixed with anything. Let's mix it with a transparent BSDF. Now watch what happens here. This is going to be really, really cool. Go ahead and plug in the transparency. Now you'll notice you can see through it. Now already that looks so cool. But let's just say you wanted just the lines to come through. How would we do that? Well, you would do it like this. So what I'm doing here, and I'm going to have to adjust my scale here a little bit. Let's check this out, guys. I'm going to adjust my scale. Notice how I can see straight through this thing. How is that possible? How are these lines the only part of this material now? That's because I've plugged in my color ramp into the FAC of the mix shader. Watch what happens if I unplug it. Different effect, right? Or you could try plugging in your Musgrave texture into the mix shader. And now, just like that, we have a transparent material mixed with our solid material. And I think I'm going to go back to constant. Yep, constant looks good. Look at that. Look at that. That just looks so cool. Wow. That is incredible. Let's see, let's mess around with this a little bit more. I think this looks so cool. See what's happening here, guys? I just want to make sure you're looking at this the right way. You can see through this material right now. You can literally see through it to the other side. So powerful. So powerful. And if you're not happy with the details here, you can adjust the dimensions here. There you go. That looks a little bit better. You can turn the dimension all the way up. Look at that, guys. That is a cool looking material. And again, this is the node setup for those of you who didn't see it. The most important thing that's happening here is with our mix shader, we have our we have our Musgrave texture plugged into the FAC. And that's basically going to say, hey, wherever this texture is, use that as the factor. So right now, the transparent part is in between these lines. And this is just so powerful. It's so incredibly powerful. And then if we wanted to, we could change the color of the transparency like this. So again, the transparency you can see straight through, but it's also kind of like glass, like you can still color it. So it's really, really interesting to mess around with. And let's say, you know what, you weren't happy with that. You wanted something that actually was glass. Well, you can just plug glass right into this shader instead. Oops. Like that. There we go. And then you can adjust the roughness. So say you wanted something like this, where like it's like rough glass and then metallic on top. That is how you would do that. So guys, that is pretty much as I'm going to go into shader nodes today. If you really enjoyed this, let me know. If you kind of liked the flow here and kind of how I went over everything, let me know. I'll be more than happy to go even more into detail with this stuff. This is really just scraping the surface here. We didn't even get into node groups. We didn't get into like really complex mixed shaders, but this is like the absolute basics of how you would do this kind of stuff. This material looks really cool, by the way. I almost want to sell this material. It's so cool. Yeah, and of course you can adjust the IOR as well. This just looks fantastic. If you wanted to make like a Dragon Ball Z Dragon Ball, you could probably make it with this type of material. Like you could add in a hue and saturation value right here. You could adjust the hue of everything, make it more orange or something. I'm just thinking out loud here, but there's a lot of cool stuff you guys could do here. It's so powerful. How fun is that? Look at the kind of cool materials we can make. All right. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you learned something. A lot of you guys have been suggesting that I go over some basic node stuff. I hope this kind of helps you understand nodes better, be a little bit more comfortable with them. A lot of creating your own material involves experimenting. And honestly, a lot of creating anything involves experimenting. So you guys are just going to have to mess around with it, figure out what you're going to learn just based on messing around with the nodes, and also what you want to accomplish can easily be accomplished with textures most of the time. As you can see, I have this like wavy Musgrave texture. There is actually a built-in brick texture. There's a lot that Blender has to offer for free. So go out there, start creating your own materials. Let me know how it goes, and drop a comment down below. Let me know if you want me to cover more tutorials like this. I'd be more than happy to. Hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you guys in the next tutorial.